Okay. So we're reminded that religion was used as an important justification for the conquest of indigenous people in the Americas. And we learned that, it was a continuation of what the Spanish had been doing before their encounter with the Americas. The Reconquista, this 800-year effort to get rid of the Moors in the Iberian Peninsula, was completed in 1492. And so they just continued doing what they had been doing before, and when they arrived to the Americas. And so yes, religion is used as a justification for the conquest. We learned that Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, was conquered in 1521, 10 years after the conquest of the Aztec capital, is when this incident regarding the Virgin de Guadalupe is said to have occurred. The story of the Virgin de Guadalupe has to do with a Mexica or Aztec man who was baptized with the name Juan Diego. And Juan Diego was walking over a hill close to Mexico City, or what was Tenochtitlan. And the name of this hill was Tepeyac. So Juan Diego is walking over this hill, and the Virgin of Guadalupe is said to have appeared to him. The Virgin of Guadalupe spoke to him in Nahuatl, the Aztec language, and she was brown-skinned. And so it was like she was a Catholic, like a Catholic virgin or saint, and indigenous to the Americas at the same time. When she appeared to Juan Diego, she asked Juan Diego to relay a message for her, to go ask the Archbishop to build a church in her honor in Tepeyac. Juan Diego says, okay, I'll do that. But he had a lot of things going on in his life. He had like a sick relative. He just didn't get to it. So the next time he needs to go over this hill of Tepeyac, he takes a different route, hoping that the Virgin Guadalupe won't appear to him, but she appeared to him anyways. And she basically says, Juan Diego, what's going on? Why haven't you done what I asked? And allegedly, Juan Diego speaks to her in the way that indigenous people were taught to speak about themselves during the colonial period. And that is in a very, kind of acknowledging this paternalistic relationship. And so, yeah, he's allegedly says something along the lines of, I'm just a poor little Indian. The Archbishop is not going to build a church just because I ask him to. And she says, okay, I'll give you some proof to take to him, so that he'll believe you and he'll listen to you. So she tells them, I want you to take that tunic, the tunic you're wearing, that kind of cape looking thing, and go to the side of the hill and pick roses, and then you're going to deliver these to him, and that's going to be a miracle that will make him listen to you. And today we might think, okay, so how are roses, how is that a miracle? Today we can get flowers of any type from any part of the world because of refrigerated cars and shipping and all that. But back then, in 1531, if it didn't grow locally at that time of year, you weren't going to find it. And so yeah, him finding roses in bloom in that location was a miracle. So He takes the roses, he delivers them to the archbishop, demands to see him. Once he's in front of him, he opens up his tunic and reveals not only the roses, but the image of the Virgin of Guadalupe had been imprinted on what he was wearing, on that tunic. This is the actual image that was imprinted on his tunic. And this is at the cathedral that exists today, that is visited by many thousands of people every year in Mexico City from all over the world. And so there is the church in Tepeyac in her honor. And the Virgin of Guadalupe, this story of the Virgin of Guadalupe was very successful. Today in Mexico, the Virgin of Guadalupe, it could be argued she's more popular than Jesus himself. Because a lot of people that are not super religious will be, they might have like a tattoo of the Virgin of Guadalupe, or they pray to her because they feel a stronger affinity to her. And so it's very successful. And, there's a long history of the Catholic Church, especially in Latin America, spreading information to back up why this is a true story and why it's a miracle. So for example, in the past, they've said, this tunic that Juan Diego was wearing was made of a material that should have disintegrated a couple hundred years ago. Like, it should not have lasted 500 years in such excellent condition as it still is today, 500 years later. And so then they say that. They've also said, we've had scientists analyze the image, and they can't explain what kind of technology was used to imprint the image onto that material. More recently, what would it be? Maybe like maybe like 10 years ago, there was a story circulating that somebody looked at the eyes of the Virgin of Guadalupe with like a microscope, or I don't know, magnifying glass. And they claim that you can see in her eyes the constellations of the stars, the way they were in 1531 above Mexico, 500 years ago. And so there's all these stories about how, kind of backing up the how true, how real this story is. And like I said, very successful. We'll learn later when we learn about Mexican independence, we'll learn about Hidalgo, kind of the first leader for Mexican independence, who used the Virgin of Guadalupe as the banner for independence. And so you could see that 300 years later, it was still a very important, very unifying symbol, the Virgin of Guadalupe. And there were similar stories throughout Latin America of other apparitions of virgins that follow this similar, maybe not as popular, but there's apparitions of virgins throughout Latin America and throughout the world, not Latin America exclusively. All right, now another point of view to this history is to be introduced to religious syncretism. And we're going to learn more about religious syncretism in the chapter about religion in Latin America. But religious syncretism is this idea that you make use of what Native Americans of Native Americans' religious beliefs prior to Christianity, and you find ways in which there's overlap between their religious beliefs and the new ones. And so some examples of this could be, for example, the Spanish would go out and destroy every religious figure they could find, and they would replace it with a cross. They would replace it with a chapel. They'd replace it with a church. They'd replace it with a cathedral. And so in that way, Native Americans were able to continue praying, continue doing pilgrimages in the same places they were already going to before, only now with their, their figures destroyed and with the new approved religious symbols in their place. And so that's example of religious syncretism. This also happened with kind of a building on that, is that they would try to destroy pyramids or temples, and then they would use the pyramid itself as a foundation for a church or cathedral. And they'd use the same stones that the pyramid or temple was built with to build a Catholic church in its place. And so again, they could continue praying in the same location they had to before. And there's also other ways where they had similar like they also had religious, marriage ceremonies. They also had coming of age ceremonies. There's just parallels, or we're not used to thinking of it this way, but if for the Aztecs, for example, if sacrifice was an important religious concept, then pointing out that Jesus Christ died on the cross, for everyone's, for all of us, is bringing attention to sacrifice in Christianity to make a connection with the significance of sacrifice in Aztec beliefs, for example. And so that's religious syncretism. But how does religious syncretism apply to the Virgin of Guadalupe? Well, it turns out that Tepeyac was already a place that was associated with a female Native American deity. One of the names that deity is referred to is Tonantzin. And again, talking about religious syncretism, the way the Catholic Church explains the apparitions of different virgins throughout the world is that they are all different versions of the same person, and that person being the Virgin Mary, Mother of Jesus. And so the Virgin of Guadalupe is a version of the Virgin Mary, Mother of Jesus. And Tonantzin, who was already, Native Americans were already used to going to do pilgrimages and pray to Tonantzin on Tepeyac Hill. Tonantzin was a mother of deities herself. And so again, you can see the overlap between the previous beliefs and the new Catholic beliefs that they wanted them to subscribe to. Another part of this is that the Virgin of Guadalupe, not an indigenous one who spoke Nahuatl, but there was already a Virgin of Guadalupe in Spain at the time that this happened. In fact, she was the most popular virgin in Spain, was the Virgin of Guadalupe. So this Virgin of Guadalupe in Mexico was not the first apparition of a Virgin of Guadalupe. She was already the most famous virgin in Spain at the time. Another part, not religious syncretism, but another part of this history that can help show a different point of view of it, is that the historical record, the church records themselves, do make no mention of the Virgin of Guadalupe in 1531 or the 1530s or the 1540s or the 1550s. It's not until almost 100 years later that the first documents begin to make mention about this miracle and apparition. And so that also leads to, creating doubt about the historical accuracy of this having happened in 1531 as portrayed.